Every February 14th, billions of dollars change hands for a saint who might be three different people, or nobody at all. The Catholic Church couldn't figure it out either, so in 1969 they erased him from their calendar. But here's the strange part. The holiday got bigger after they deleted it. No church, no saint, no problem. Valentine's Day survived its own cancellation and became the second largest card-giving holiday on Earth. This is the story of how confusion became tradition and why not knowing the truth made it more powerful. Subscribe if you want the Church's receipts on every holiday they've quietly ghosted. The Catholic Church maintains a master list called the General Roman Calendar, their official roster of saints worthy of universal celebration. For centuries, Saint Valentine held a spot on February 14th. Then, on February 14th, 1969, in what might be history's most ironic piece of timing, the Church removed approximately 200 saints from this calendar. Valentine was among them. The reason? Apart from his name and burial location on the Via Flaminia, nothing reliable could be confirmed about him. The Church didn't deny his existence. They simply admitted they couldn't prove enough to justify keeping him on the universal calendar. He remained in the Roman martyrology, but lost his guaranteed feast day. Local churches could still celebrate him. Most didn't. The secular world had no such concerns about documentation. This removal happened because the Church had a Valentine problem brewing for over a millennium. Early martyrologies reference at least 3 different Valentines who died on February 14th during the 3rd century. One was a Roman priest. Another was the bishop of Interamna, modern-day Terni. Both were buried along the Via Flaminia at different distances from Rome. A third was martyred in Africa. The accounts are contradictory and filled with legendary elements added centuries after the events. Here's what historians consider probable. Someone named Valentine was martyred and buried on the Via Flaminia around 269 or 270 during Emperor Claudius II Gothicus' persecution of Christians. This was the 3rd century crisis, barbarian invasions, rampant inflation, political chaos. Christians made convenient scapegoats. Valentine, whether priest or bishop, was caught in this sweep. The legends surrounding Valentine's execution read like different drafts of the same story. The most popular claims he secretly married Christian soldiers whom the emperor had forbidden to marry. Married men made worse soldiers because they had families to return to. When discovered, Valentine was arrested and brought before Claudius II. The emperor tried converting him to Roman paganism. Valentine refused and tried converting the emperor instead. This enraged Claudius, who sentenced him to execution. Another version has Valentine under house arrest by Judge Asterius. During their conversations, Valentine claimed he could restore sight to Asterius's blind daughter. When he succeeded, Asterius and his household of 46 people converted. Claudius ordered everyone executed. This healing miracle became one of the most repeated elements of Valentine's legend. The problem? These stories don't appear in contemporary 3rd century sources. The earliest detailed accounts come from the 5th or 6th century. Scholars note these texts likely borrowed miracle elements from accounts of other martyrs, common practice in hagiography. The 8th century Gelasian Sacramentary recorded Valentine's feast on February 14th, but gave no biographical details. By the time Bede compiled his martyrology in the 8th century, he included these legendary elements as fact. The Golden Legend in the 13th century repeated and embellished them further. The 18th century added the most famous romantic detail. Valentine wrote a letter to his jailer's daughter before execution, signing it, "Your Valentine." This became the origin story for Valentine's Day cards. Historians now recognize it as a later addition with no basis in earlier sources. The confusion stems from Valentinus being extremely common in late antiquity. The name derives from Latin valens, worthy, strong, powerful. At least 11 other saints named Valentine exist in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Encyclopedia found 3 Valentines specifically connected to February 14th. The Roman and Terni Valentines were both buried on the Via Flaminia, leading scholars to conclude these might be different versions of the same person's story, with Rome and Terni each claiming him. Physical evidence complicates things. Pope Julius I built a basilica over Valentine's burial site on the Via Flaminia around the 4th century. In the 13th century, Valentine's relics were transferred to the Church of Santa Prassede in Rome. But here's where it gets strange. Multiple churches worldwide now claim to possess Valentine's remains. Rome displays a flower-crowned skull. Prague houses a shoulder blade. Dublin possesses a vessel allegedly tinged with his blood. Missouri keeps relics inside a wax effigy. Churches in Malta, Poland, France, Austria, and Scotland all claim pieces of Saint Valentine. The proliferation suggests either multiple Valentines or a medieval relic trade that prioritized demand over authenticity. Archaeological evidence confirms a Valentine cult existed. Roman catacombs and ancient churches dedicated to him are real. The Via Flaminia burial site exists. What remains uncertain is whether the person buried there performed the legendary acts, or whether storytellers gradually attached miracle narratives to an otherwise ordinary martyrdom. The Second Vatican Council set the stage for Valentine's removal by requiring martyrdom accounts to accord with historical facts. They wanted to streamline the liturgical calendar, removing saints who weren't universally important. The document stated, "Though the memorial of Saint Valentine is ancient, it is left to particular calendars, since, apart from his name, nothing is known of Saint Valentine except that he was buried on the Via Flaminia on February 14th. Pope Gelasius I, in 496, had established the feast day, declaring Valentine among those whose names are justly reverenced but whose acts are known only to God. Even in the 5th century, uncertainty surrounded his life. Modern scholars have debunked the claim that Gelasius replaced the pagan festival Lupercalia with Valentine's Day. That theory lacks evidence. By 1969, the Church could no longer justify celebrating a saint whose entire biography consisted of contradictory legends written centuries after his supposed death. They kept him in the martyrology out of respect for ancient tradition, but removed the universal feast day requirement. What the Church didn't anticipate was that removing official recognition would have zero impact on the holiday's popularity. If anything, Deletion freed Valentine's Day from ecclesiastical control, allowing it to evolve into the secular celebration of romance that now generates billions in annual revenue. The transformation of Valentine from obscure martyr to romantic icon didn't happen overnight. It took a 14th century poet, a misunderstanding about bird mating seasons, and eventually, an American businesswoman to turn February 14th into what we recognize today. Geoffrey Chaucer invented romantic Valentine's Day. Not intentionally, and probably not knowingly, but the evidence is overwhelming. Before Chaucer's 1382 poem, The Parliament of Fowls, no surviving text anywhere connects Saint Valentine with romantic love. Scholar Jack Orich surveyed the entire corpus of medieval literature and found nothing. No Valentine love letters. No romantic traditions. No celebrations of courtship on February 14th. Orich concluded that Chaucer was the original mythmaker in this instance. The poem itself is peculiar. Approximately 700 lines of Middle English verse describing a dream vision in which the narrator witnesses a gathering of birds on Saint Valentine's Day to choose their mates. Nature presides over the assembly. 3 noble eagles compete for the affection of a female eagle. Each makes his case. One claims to love her best. Another says he's loved her longest. The third promises to worship her most. The other birds grow impatient waiting for their turn and offer contradictory advice about love. The female eagle, overwhelmed by the debate, asks nature for a year to decide. Nature agrees. The poem ends without resolution, but with celebration. Most scholars believe Chaucer wrote this to commemorate the marriage negotiations between 15-year-old King Richard II and Anne of Bohemia, also 15. In 1382, the negotiations had dragged on for 5 years and nearly collapsed multiple times. The 3 competing eagles likely represent Richard and 2 rival suitors for Anne's hand. The postponement in the poem mirrors the prolonged diplomatic wrangling. But none of this explains why Chaucer set the scene on St. Valentine's Day specifically. The answer involves either Chaucer's ignorance of ornithology or his willingness to bend facts for poetry. The poem states clearly, "For this was on St. Valentine's Day, when every fowl comes there to choose his mate." Chaucer presents this as established fact, something everyone knows. The problem is that birds in England don't mate on February 14th. Some birds do pair up in February: missel thrush, raven, partridge, rook, heron, grebe, lapwing, blackbird, but most species wait until March or later. So why did Chaucer think mid-February was mating season? The answer lies in medieval calendars. The date marking the beginning of spring was wildly inconsistent in 14th century England. Different calendars place spring's start on February 7th, February 22nd, or both. Chaucer's February 14th on the Julian calendar corresponds roughly to February 23rd on our modern calendar, which gets closer to actual spring. Additionally, the medieval folk belief that birds chose mates in February was widespread, regardless of what birds actually did. Chaucer likely repeated common wisdom without verification. What matters is that Chaucer was essentially the Kardashian of his era. His cultural influence was enormous. When he wrote that Valentine's Day was when birds chose their mates, his friends, notably poets Othon de Grandson and John Gower, immediately picked up the theme in their own work. Within decades, Valentine's Day as a day for lovers had entered the aristocratic vocabulary. By the 15th century, people were writing actual valentines to each other. The oldest surviving Valentine is from February 1415. Charles, Duke of Orleans, imprisoned in the Tower of London after the Battle of Agincourt, wrote a poem to his wife using Valentine as a term of endearment. The poem repeats the phrase multiple times. "I am already sick with love, my very gentle Valentine." This wasn't the first Valentine ever written. Charles uses Valentine, naturally, suggesting the practice was already familiar, but it's the earliest that survives. The British Library preserves it today. By the 1700s, handmade valentines had become common in Britain. These weren't cards in the modern sense, but elaborate handcrafted creations featuring hand-tatted lace, pressed flowers, ribbons, watercolor paintings, and romantic verses. For those who couldn't compose their own poetry, printed verse guides provided suggestions. The York Castle Museum in England holds what's believed to be the oldest printed valentine, created in London in 1797. It features hand-colored illustrations. Full-color printing didn't exist yet, with elaborate floral patterns, cupids, doves, and paper lace created by piercing holes in intricate designs. These handmade valentines were expensive to mail. Before postal reform, recipients paid the postage based on distance and number of pages. Sending a single sheet from London to Edinburgh cost 1 shilling and 1.5 pence, more than a day's wage for working-class people and nearly 14 times the actual cost to the post office. This made valentines a luxury for the wealthy. Everything changed on January 10, 1840, when Britain introduced the uniform penny post. Rowland Hill, a government postal official, had published a revolutionary pamphlet arguing that postal charges should be based on weight rather than distance and pages, and that senders rather than recipients should pay. The result was the world's first postage stamp, the penny black, and a flat rate of 1 penny to mail anything anywhere in Britain. Valentine cards exploded. In 1841, nearly 500,000 valentines were posted in Britain. By 1871, that number grew to 1.2 million cards in London alone. Postmen received a special refreshment allowance on February 14th to help them handle the crushing workload. Mass production made cards affordable. Printing technology advanced rapidly. Machine-printed lithographs, embossed paper, and die-cut designs became standard. Victorian valentines featured lace, satin, small mirrors, pressed grasses, and elaborate pop-up mechanisms. Some were architectural marvels, unfolding into three-dimensional scenes. Not all Victorian valentines were sweet. The era also produced vinegar valentines, cards designed specifically to insult. These featured grotesque caricatures and cruel verses sent anonymously to people the sender disliked. The insults targeted professions for men, appearances for women, and racial minorities. Before postal reform, these cards were particularly vicious because they were sent cash on delivery, forcing the recipient to pay a penny to receive an insulting card. Popular verses included, "Why do they call you a nasty old cat, and say many things a deal ruder than that? 'Tis from envy perhaps of your manifold graces. How would it please you to claw well their faces?" By the mid-1850s, Valentine cards had become so prevalent that the New York Times published sharp criticism on February 14, 1856. "Our bows and bells are satisfied with a few miserable lines neatly written upon fine paper. Or else they purchase a printed valentine with verses ready-made, some of which are costly and many of which are cheap and indecent. The custom with us has no useful feature, and the sooner it is abolished the better." The complaint went nowhere. America's Valentine industry began with one woman. Esther Howland of Worcester, Massachusetts received an ornate English Valentine in 1849 from a business associate of her father, who owned a stationery shop. She was 19 years old and had just graduated from Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, one of the few colleges accepting women. Howland decided she could make better Valentines than the expensive British imports. She created prototypes using paper lace, lithographed images, and embossed details, all materials her father could source through his business. She sent samples to her father's business contacts, expecting orders worth perhaps $200. The orders totaled $5,000. Within a year, she had established the New England Valentine Company, hired 4 women to work in her family home, and created an assembly line system where each woman specialized in one aspect of card creation. One attached lace, another added ribbons, a third positioned the central image, the fourth assembled and packaged. Howland's cards sold at various price points, from 25 cents to $35, the equivalent of over $100 in today's money for the most elaborate designs. She became known as the mother of the American Valentine and built a business that grossed hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Her success lasted decades until she sold the company in 1881. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection includes multiple examples of her work, preserved as historical artifacts of American entrepreneurship. British illustrator Kate Greenaway made Valentines into fine art during the same period. Her first Valentine card in 1868 sold over 25,000 copies in weeks. Her designs featured soft pastel colors and characters dressed in historical clothing from past eras, remarkable in a time before easy historical research. Greenaway was one of the few female illustrators to achieve commercial success in late 1800s Britain, and her distinctive style became instantly recognizable. The American greeting card industry consolidated around a few major players. Brothers Joyce, Raleigh, and William Hall founded Hall Brothers Company in Kansas City, Missouri, selling postcards starting in 1910. In 1913, they added Valentines to their inventory, initially purchasing designs from other companies. A fire in 1915 destroyed their postcard inventory, prompting them to invest in printing equipment and start producing their own original designs. By 1916, the first Hallmark-produced Valentine's Day cards appeared on store shelves. The company formally became Hallmark in 1928. George C. Whitney created another Valentine empire in Worcester, Massachusetts. After his brother's death, Whitney bought out competitors, including Howland's company. Unlike some competitors who produced comic Valentines, Whitney refused to use love's gifts as a medium for ridicule. His cards often featured hearts or were heart-shaped. A 1915 magazine estimated that 90% of American Valentines came from Worcester, largely due to Whitney's dominance. By the early 20th century, Valentine's Day had fully commercialized. Companies added chocolates in heart-shaped boxes, introduced conversation hearts with messages like "Be mine" and "Kiss me," and marketed jewelry, flowers, and perfume specifically for February 14th. The holiday that began as a feast day for a saint the church could barely document had become the second largest card-giving occasion in America after Christmas. According to the Greeting Card Association, Americans now exchange approximately 145 million Valentine's Day cards annually, not including classroom Valentines for children. When kids' Valentines are included, the number exceeds 1 billion cards per year. The National Retail Federation reports that the average person celebrating Valentine's Day spent $185 in 2024. Valentine's Day generates over $20 billion in annual spending in the United States alone. The holiday is now celebrated in Canada, Mexico, the United Kingdom, France, Australia, Denmark, Italy, and dozens of other countries, each adapting the tradition to local customs. The irony is profound. A saint removed from the Church's universal calendar in 1969 for lack of historical evidence now anchors a multi-billion-dollar global industry. So here's what we know for certain. Saint Valentine was probably real. Someone by that name was martyred and buried on the Via Flaminia in the 3rd century. Everything else, the secret marriages, the miracle healing, the letter signed, "Your Valentine," ranges from uncertain to invented. The Catholic Church admitted as much when they removed him from their calendar in 1969, keeping his name on the books but acknowledging they couldn't verify his story. And yet, the holiday survived. It thrived. It became bigger after the church deleted it than it ever was under their authority. Because Valentine's Day stopped being about Valentine somewhere around 1382, when Geoffrey Chaucer wrote a poem about birds choosing mates. Chaucer probably got his ornithology wrong. He definitely created something that didn't exist before. Within a century, aristocrats were exchanging valentines. Within 5 centuries, it was a commercial juggernaut. The pattern is remarkable. A saint with no verified biography becomes a feast day. A poet misunderstands bird behavior and creates a romantic tradition. A postal reform makes cards affordable. A 19-year-old woman turns paper and lace into a fortune. A greeting card company in Kansas City makes it a national ritual. Each accident builds on the previous one. None of it was designed. All of it worked. Valentine's Day is what happens when history collides with marketing, when confusion becomes tradition, when nobody bothers to check if something is true because the story is better than the facts. The holiday exists in the gap between what we know and what we want to believe. That gap turned out to be worth $25 billion annually. The church removed Valentine because they valued historical accuracy over tradition. The world kept Valentine because tradition doesn't require accuracy. It requires repetition, commerce, and the collective agreement to participate in something we all know is constructed. We buy the cards knowing Chaucer made it up. We send the flowers knowing the saint might be 3 different people. We celebrate knowing the church gave up on the whole thing 55 years ago. And that might be the most honest thing about Valentine's Day. It's a holiday that doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is, a commercial celebration built on accidents, sustained by industry, and embraced because we decided centuries ago that mid-February needed something to look forward to. The mystery of Saint Valentine was never solved. It was monetized. If you made it this far, you now know more about Valentine's Day than most people who celebrate it, and possibly more than you wanted to know. The next time someone asks you about the history of Valentine's Day, you can tell them the truth. Nobody knows. The church gave up trying to figure it out. And a medieval poet who didn't understand birds is mostly responsible for the whole thing. Happy Valentine's Day. Or as Charles, Duke of Orleans, might have written from his prison cell in 1415, I am already sick with love, my very gentle viewers. Thanks for watching.